So we have three new movies this weekend. One that I saw on time, one that I saw early, and one that I saw a week late. So we're all over the place. But of course, we're going to start with John Wick 3, Parabellum, which I was extremely excited for, of course, because I was a huge fan of the first movie when it came out in 2014. And while I didn't think it was quite as good as the first one, I still really, really like the second one. I actually like the second one I like the more I see it. And the different ways it unfolds and the way it expands on the world more is something that I've been growing to appreciate the more I see it. So needless to say, hype for this one was pretty much through the roof, especially given that 2 ends on like one of the most intense cliffhangers in recent memory. And sure enough, it does start immediately in that moment, as he's running away from Ian McShane after he's been considered excommunicado. So, in the sole opening scene that I really like especially is when you think back to the second movie, and like the layout of it, where we have the opening scene in the second movie where it's the whole thing with Peter Stormare, where he was Viggo's brother, so he's got to kind of tie up that one last loose end to make sure, nothing else goes haywire after the incident from the first movie. But this one has no time for, like, the intro, an introductory scene that was, like, in the second movie, it's like, a 10 to 15 minute introduction. Then we get the title, and then it kind of goes into the story and gradually works its way back around. But with this one, there was no time for that, so we get the title immediately, which kind of just immediately to me was a clue, yeah, it's going to have to get started immediately and not stop. So that was really exciting, and sure enough, we've got the whole countdown of the hour that he was given as it gets there. It's sort of like waiting for the purge to happen or something. You're waiting to hear the siren. And then finally, all hell gets to break loose once the time hits, and he is not only does he have a $14 million contract on him that's going to keep going up as time goes on. The more he survives, the more the contract is going to go up, and the fact that he can't enlist any of the help that he had before. Basically being stranded, and the posters really show this off well. That one in particular, where it's like it's mostly empty area, and it's just him showing just how singular he looks, and then just the crowd of people pointing guns at him. Really does sell that point well, and we do go like really into it for a while there. We've got the whole opening scene where he fights the giant dude in the library. There's the moment when we get to see him use knives more than we ever have before, and he can throw knives about as fast as he can shoot bullets. Just these really glorious sequences of this really, really brutal violence. I went at a different time of day than I usually do, so I was able to watch this with a crowd. And if you can manage that, that is absolutely recommended, because not that anybody was being obnoxious, but it's just the violence is so brutal. But in a good way, like in the way you would expect out of a movie like this, and kind of what you somewhat go there for. How when the crowd reacts, it's involuntary, because of just you just react the way you're going to without even thinking about it to the stuff that this movie is showing. So that's a really fun, like, shared experience to have with a lot of people, especially with how it is getting increasingly over the top. Some people may be against that, but I think it's something that we've kind of gradually seen. If you watch the first movie, then you watch the second movie. By the time it gets to this, it might, like, when it gets to the horse kicking people or Halle Berry's dogs, the action can seem even more over the top in these movies than it ever has been so far. And once again, since we kind of we expect to get bigger and bigger as it goes on, and the more the movies go on, especially with the stakes getting as higher and higher as they're getting, yeah, it's really just kind of natural that the action scenes just get even more over the top as they go. As long as they don't go full-on cartoony, which they don't. I think the brutality kind of grounds them and keeps them from going too much in that direction. So that helps a lot. And of course, we've got the added cast members of the two guys from the Raid movies in particular. The guy that played Mad Dog, and then the guy that was the assassin in the Raid 2, the one that Rama fights in the kitchen at the end. And that's just two of the hundreds of thousands of people coming after him in this. And you've got, some returning characters like Lawrence Fishburne and all the others. And yeah, as far as the whole world building thing, it is something that, like I said, I was really happy to see in the second movie, because the thing about it was, I actually wasn't sure about that the first time I saw the second movie, because what I loved about the first movie was just sort of the simplicity of it. And it was something that really, it seemed like it was kind of risky to take something that was really thriving on being as simple as it was, because even the way it was marketed was about its simplicity, where it's, you'll never believe what Keanu Reeves does when somebody, kills his dog and steals his car. But then, as it is really, really building on this as much as it can, and I'm under the impression it was always meant to be a trilogy at least. Yeah, but I will say, even though I liked how they built on it in the second movie, they do continue to build on it, and while I really love the ambition of it, it does almost feel like it's getting maybe in some cases it's getting a little too wrapped up in that, and maybe they're getting a little too ambitious too early. Because eventually he's starting to get, all over the world at this point. In more ways than one, the middle does kind of reach a bit of a dry spot. Eventually with him ending up in the middle of a desert. I will say, and there is a point to this, to an extent, but the thing that I say it's mainly them possibly getting too wrapped up in the world building is that, without saying too much, what he is out there doing and what the middle kind of really drags on, and the point that it gets us to, and this turn he seems to have to make as a character, by the time we come back around to the climax, a lot of it doesn't matter in the long run, and then that's kind of when it occurs to you that it feels like maybe it shouldn't really be as stretched out as it is. And a lot of it just kind of feels like filler when you look back on it and what the ultimate results are. So that's a little disappointing, and another thing also with that is, another thing that kind of disappointed me a little bit was that, we're talking about the whole plot about him being, he can't get help from anybody, and that's the setup, is it's John Wick all alone having to do things by himself. And the thing about that is that even though he's known to be, the big, ultimate, scary, badass dude, he has been getting help consistently throughout the first two movies, which might maybe possibly take away some of his badassery if you look too much into it. Like, the scene in the first movie when he gets trapped and he gets tied to the chair, and he gets the bag over his head, and it's like he's gonna get out of this somehow. And it's like that was the great thing about that, was that Viggo walks away from that scene, and he's tied to this chair, and he's assuming he's gonna die, so it's a big thing when he just shows up in front of Viggo's car, somehow having gotten out of this, and is shooting at him, and that's where Viggo's fear of him comes from. But we know, because we see the whole layout, that the only reason he got out of that was because of Willem Dafoe and his rifle across the street. But the thing that I didn't mind about that, the thing that I think still made him a badass, even though he got so much help, was the fact that it's not necessarily just, how well he kills people that's his job. It's also him deciding, who his friends are going to be, and who he trusts, and who he's going to keep close. So when Willem Dafoe saves him in that moment, it's like, that's also the fact that he was smart enough to keep a person like Marcus still kind of in his life a little bit, and that he made the right choice in that. And with the shady-ass people that are in this business with him, I imagine that takes some picking and choosing of who you're going to have on your side. And how he seems capable enough of being able to know who's going to turn on him and who isn't, for the most part. So I never minded him getting help in the first movies. I don't think it really took away from, the awesomeness of the character at all. But with that said, it was so exciting to think, what's he gonna do in this without help? Because he just can't. That's against the rules now, is that he has to be alone in this. And, the entire movie is him getting help. The whole movie is him going from person to person that's secretly helping him. And it's like, oh, well, okay, that kind of felt like you kind of shat on your premise there a little bit. That's unfortunate. But I mean, it does open up to, we get to bring Lawrence Fishburne back in, which is great, and we get to meet new characters like Halle Berry and Angelica Houston and all them. But I was really looking forward to that premise of just seeing him work entirely alone. In the movie is just the opposite of that. um, but that's not to say that we don't get some amazing scenes out of it. The whole big action scene with Halle Berry is really good. Like I said, even if it seems like it's going a little over the top, it's after a while it just sort of fits. Like you just sort of expect it. And then they've been building up a lot that there's a scene of him riding a horse early in the movie. With all the build-up isn't as lengthy as it might seem, and it might also give you flashbacks of like True Lies or something, and it's like, okay, so if somebody like Cameron did something similar to this, how are you gonna make it go above and beyond? But of course, the makers of John Wick know how to make things go above and beyond, so they find a way to make it extremely memorable and probably top the whole True Lies scene. Certainly more big and over the top in a great way. So. But I do think there are some things here that don't quite work, especially when it gets a bit self-aware. Like, the thing that I love about the first movie is just how kind of pretty straight-faced it is, despite the plot. Like, the people know the plot going in. It's Keanu Reeves killing people over his dead puppy. But the fact that it played it so straight-faced is why it worked so well, and it was so stylish and so awesome, is where the greatness of that movie comes from. And now it's getting like more and more self-aware as it goes, and I don't know that this is the direction for these movies, even though it might seem like it on paper and given the concept. But I don't know, because it's getting to where, like, there's a moment where Halle Berry thinks that her dog has been shot and she's getting revved up, and he's just off to the side saying, yeah, I get that. And it's like, yeah, we know. They're, like, really milking the whole, this is all over a dead puppy thing. And it's like, that was the thing in the first movie, and then they still talked about it in the second movie. They're still talking about it now. And like I said, now it just kind of feels like they're milking the fact that that's how people felt about their concept. And it's like, I think it's trying to seem like it's being tongue-in-cheek about it. It's like, yeah, we know how ridiculous it sounds, but I think we knew that from the first movie. It's just, we appreciated how straight-faced they were about it. And yeah, it does start to get pretty jokey. There is, a new villain named Zero, I believe, who's really cool, but, there is a moment where, and it's a good moment, like in the moment, it's great and unexpected, where John Wick and Zero have an interaction in the lobby of the Continental Hotel, and it's a scene that kind of catches you off guard after everything that's come before it, and it's a great moment, but then pretty much most of the villain characters do the same thing in this scene as the climax goes on, and they really kind of kill what was like, that was really good about that moment and really unexpected about that moment, when they just start having all the characters do it, and then it kind of takes away from it. But that's not to say that the climax isn't still totally insane. And the setting, it's probably kind of a spoiler to say where the climax is set, but they really, just the whole design of this whole setting is totally unreal, and just how it's, yeah, I don't want to say too much about it, but it's like, imagine the scene in Skyfall when he fights Patrice, I think was the guy's name, where he had like the giant jellyfish behind him and the lights and all that. It's like that, only like layers of it. And it's really incredible looking. Like, that's the thing, is I do have, like, problems with what this movie. I have more problems with this movie than I do the other two. Like, I probably like them in their order. But a lot of the things that I don't particularly care for about this one are things that kind of make me, a little more iffy than I would be in the other two. Is for the most part pretty overshadowed by just how insane and ambitious and flawless the action scenes are, and just how their brutality really, really goes forward, and just like everyone is like memorable. Like, that's the problem with these action movies that, you know, have so much action in them, is after a while they can kind of, you know, get tired, and feels like it's sort of the same stuff, and it's like, you can tell they put so much detail in these fight scenes that, like, every blow that happens is going to be different than the one that came before it. And every moment is going to be... is going to have, like, those really big moments. Like, every now and then you'll have a fight scene that has, like, one of those moments that just really stand out. But this one is pretty much just kind of those constant hits all the way through. It's just there is, like, kind of a big gap in the middle where it's like... and then, like I said, the fact that this gap more or less leads to something that really doesn't matter much in the long run, just kind of really takes away from the full product. But yeah, and then you've got the ending, where it's... one thing I was going to say about the middle just then that I almost forgot was when I was talking about there's a desert, I do kind of like the contrast of... you've got, like, John Wick in the middle of a desert, and you've got, like, the sort of the color of the desert, and how, like, that sort of red and brightness and orange sort of really contrasts with the sort of blue and the buildings we're so used to seeing in the city and all that, especially the rain in the opening scene. So I did like the contrast, and that was another way to show, like, how alone he really seemed, because he's usually surrounded by all this stuff, and just to see him literally in the middle of nowhere for a scene was, like, did really hit that home. But then one thing also that I'm not sure I'm entirely crazy about yet, I could totally have my mind changed. That I was under the, like, once again, if you don't want to know, like, anything whatsoever, this might be spoilery, but it might also be something that you see coming from a mile away. The talk about this being a trilogy, and the fact that it was always intended to be a trilogy, I don't know about anybody else, but I went into this, and I'm trying to remember if I heard anything specific that made me think this, but I went into this, and I have been, you know, like, the whole time they were planning this, ever since the second movie, over 2 years ago. But I was under the impression that this was, like, an end. Like, this was meant to be, like a complete trilogy, and this was going to be, like, the big, giant finale of it. Nope, it is incredibly open. They are definitely gonna try to keep this thing going for as long as they can. Which sucks, because I actually wouldn't have minded if this movie went another 20 minutes or so. It would have been a 2.5-hour movie. But what the direction they promise they're going in, I would have watched them resolve this in a 20-minute climax, what they set up at the end of this one when it stops. But so I'm a little worried that they plan on still going with, like, entire movies, I guess. But hopefully they can be more like... they can be less like the Fast and Furious movies, and, like, really run out of gas at this point, like the way the 8th movie has. Or they can be like Mission Impossible, and they can just ramp it up every time, and just when you think they've done the most insane thing they can do, the next one will do something even more insane, which I do think they're capable of. I just hope they don't get too silly, and I hope they don't stray too far into the tongue-in-cheek, self-aware thing. But we'll see. But I do still like it a lot. So like I said, it's the fact that, you know, we can see movies now with action scenes like this is a blessing no matter what. So, that's how I feel about that. So there's there's a sliver of disappointment in there, but I'm still interested to see what they go. And I am, like I said, I am really hyped about where they leave it. I just think they could have put wherever it's going in this movie. So, that's how I feel about that. Alright, let's go on to Brightburn. Now this is, I just said this for John Wick, but I'm definitely saying it now. I'm not going to try to outright spoil anything, but I do think if this is a movie that you're trying to go into blind, this is something that you don't want to hear. Like, go into it totally and completely blind. You may just want to move on, or, you know, come back later, or whatever the hell you want to do. So, this movie obviously has an interesting setup from the get-go, where it's basically, I mean, it doesn't necessarily feel original, but there is something to where it's tweaked just enough to where you're like, okay, I'm interested. The whole idea of if you literally just tell the story of Superman, only the kid is evil. And it's like, instead of seeing like a superhero origin story, we're getting a supervillain origin story. Um, the second one in the past couple of years after Split. It's also got like not like the style or anything, but it also might remind you a lot of Chronicle, particularly the Dane DeHaan character in Chronicle, and if like we saw him with those powers in childhood, and pretty much the same thing happened, the same consequences. So when it starts, though, we do meet the married couple who are Elizabeth Banks and David Emmon, and it's after a lot of, blatant clues that they're having trouble conceiving, lo and behold, a child literally just drops out of the sky and into their laps. And then we don't really see much of what becomes of that. We just immediately cut to, well, he's a kid now, and he seems fine, but then things are going to start to get weirder and maybe more sinister while they're at it. So what's going on here is that what I liked about it at the start was the fact that even though it's kind of starts off like it's going to be, something like Superman and then eventually get more sinister, the whole thing just kind of has this general vibe of a horror movie. Where it's like, it's not like they're trying to play it up like it's something great and then there's just going to be a drastic turn. Like, they keep the tone in check to where even when they're like, a happy family more or less, you can still sense that something is off or something is about to go down. But the problem with that also is that when you have the vibe of it being a horror movie from the get-go, it's going to get pretty predictable, probably way before it should be. And this is a short-ass movie. It's like an hour and a half, hour 35. So it gets to where it's going. Like, it feels very, very chopped down. Like, I feel like there's got to be a ton of deleted scenes to this. But the thing here is that it's one of those cases where, since you have that horror movie vibe, we start meeting a lot of the characters, and they do try to do the thing where, like, they somewhat touch on the, infertility thing, so they try to make the characters, like, as human as possible, where we see, David Emmon and Elizabeth Banks talking. It's like one of those cases where you're like, oh, this is the character development. I don't feel it, but it's present. Okay. And it's like the screenwriter saying, we just need to put this in here, so it seems like we care about the characters when really we just want to get to the gore as fast as we can. So that's the thing, is when we meet side characters, it's one of those cases where, just like a horror movie, it's really easy to tell who is probably unsafe, and whose days or hours are probably numbered. And so, before we even get into that, like, before we even get into the potential, other characters being in danger, there's just the whole thing of him slowly discovering what he's capable of. And it just feels really disjointed pretty much all the time, because this is one of those cases where you kind of want to just embrace it and take the scenes as individual scenes, but they're just so nonchalantly handled that it stands out, that you can't help but notice. So we start with this lawnmower thing, where the dad brings out the lawnmower and the kid's like, he's gonna do it, and the dad leaves, and of course he's having trouble with it, so he launches it across this entire field, and then when he goes and sees it turned over, the blade is still spinning. And so he sticks his hand in the blade and just completely fucks it up, because he's indestructible. He completely annihilates this lawnmower blade. His dad or anybody never asks him about this lawnmower. The lawnmower is never brought up again after that. Nobody sees this happen. Nobody knows what happened to this lawnmower. It is just gone from this story forever, despite him mauling it with his indestructibleness. And then fast forward to the scene where he's got a fork, like a metal fork in his mouth, and he is chewing it. and he just completely destroys it. His dad witnesses this one, but wouldn't you know it, it's never brought up again. They go upstairs. He goes upstairs to tell Elizabeth Banks about it, and then he gets distracted, and they start talking about his potential masturbation habits. And instead of him going, "So, Elizabeth Banks, you'll never believe what our son just did to a metal fork with his fucking teeth," it just cuts to him going hunting with the kid and giving him an awkward pep talk on masturbation. For the sake of comedy, I guess. The comedy relief scene or whatever. Okay, but we've really got to talk about this fucking lawnmower and this fucking fork, don't we? Does somebody want to talk about this? Does somebody want to bring this up? But it just keeps going, and they just keep saying, you know, like, oh, he's different. Until he starts fucking people up. And then it goes in the directions that you expect it to. And so, and it's real quick to get to those moments, too. Before it's like a flat-out horror movie where people are, like, in physical danger, there's a brief moment where it's a stalker movie. Where it's like, you know, and it's so sudden when he decides to kind of go evil, like it's, I mean, obviously it's, you know, whatever's inside him or whatever, but I mean, still, the order of events is basically, he gets bullied in school, where they just think he's weird, I guess. He's an outcast for whatever reason, because he's smart, I guess. But there's a girl that, like, takes up for him. She says, like, one thing. She says, like, you know, hey, smart kids are gonna rule the world. Which, of course, he takes the wrong way. But before that, it's like, oh, okay, so he's got a crush on her because she said a sentence to him. And then, like, 2 minutes in movie time later, he's using his powers to, like, go to her fucking room at night. And it's treated like a horror scene. Not like some kid has a crush and he's doing misguided things with the powers that he has. No, it is played up as a straight, you know, scary-ass sort of stalker thing, where he's in the fucking curtains and shit, and she is scared out of her mind. And it's like, when I was talking about the tonal shift, there's... Yeah, it's not the whole... like I said, it does the right thing by having the whole thing feel sort of off in some way. But these middle portions where it takes, like, drastic turns... but, like, the underlying is, like, a straight line, but you have these jerks in the tone that just really are just kind of... It feels like things are quite out of order, too. That's another problem. Where it's like, I feel like the fork thing should have come long before the lawnmower thing. But that's not the case, either. And then, like I said, eventually it's ready to be a gore fest. Which people will probably be pleased to an extent if that's what they're here for. Both Brightburn and John Wick are not the movies to see if you've got a problem with bad things happening to eyeballs. But there is one scene, and I don't know whether to give them credit or what. I mean, I guess, because it's like, because the effect is so well done. Brightburn does have something that kind of caught me by surprise a little bit. I used to be pretty squeamish as a kid, but as time goes on, not a whole lot, but it's probably being aware enough of, like, how effects work and stuff like that. But there is a scene of gore in this movie, and you will know it when you see it. Like, there's gore in the movie, but I mean, there is one scene that, like, is way worse than the rest of the scenes. And for the first time, and I don't know when, I couldn't look at this. I had to look away from the screen. And I had to, like, to the point to where I tried to glance at it, but I eventually just had to look away until the scene was over, because I couldn't do it. It's probably the most nauseating moment of gore, to me, personally, since Naomi Watts' leg in The Impossible, if anybody remembers that. And I just, like, it took, like, it was maybe 20 minutes later in the movie where I think I somewhat recovered from that. And it was long after that whole, after that whole thing. So, yeah, if that's what you're there for, there that is. But something about this, though, and the way the characters kind of turn into horror movie victims, is take the Matt Jones character, for instance, the guy that played Badger on Breaking Bad, I believe, where he has two crucial scenes. There's a scene of him at the kid's birthday party where he's introduced as his uncle, and then there's his scene later. And in this scene and this scene, it's basically like he's two different characters. Where it's like he's the dude that, gets him the present at the birthday party that the dad doesn't approve of, but he's still a friend of the family and all that. And then suddenly he's this douchebag that's just waiting to land in the arms of death. And it's just really... I don't remember the character having any sort of indication of this in his first scene whatsoever, but it's like, well, we gotta make you dislike the character so that you can get some sort of odd pleasure, I guess, by when the gory scenes come. I don't know. But yeah, and then eventually it gets to a point where we realize the whole, the kid ruling the world thing, where the girl gives him the idea of that. And the thing is that he's basically just sort of saying nonchalantly, like, I know my powers now, and I'm superior. Like, I'm superior to all the things on Earth. And there's nothing you can do about it. And then it's like, okay, I get what this is now. To me, it felt like the whole fucking thing of him doing all this shit is basically like a metaphor for the whole teen angst thing. Where it's like when you're a really young teenager and you're a total idiot, but you think you know everything, and you think that everything around the world is just like your puppet show. And it's basically this kid living this out, and his powers give him the ability to literally feel like he is superior to the rest of the world. So if that's the kind of thing that's going to appeal to you, that's a big assumption that that's what they're going for, but that's what it felt like to me. So there's that too. So I don't know if the issue is that it's too short. I feel like that because there's so much, but at the same time, it's like I don't know that I don't care enough about it or the characters in it to want it to be longer. Like, if somebody said, oh, we fixed Brightburn, we put a lot more scenes in it so things kind of flow nicer. I mean, that's worked before, so I would eventually maybe look at this hypothetical cut, but it would take a while because I just don't give a shit enough about it. Or its characters or anything like that. Like, the characters do not resonate at all, no matter how hard they try. I was wondering if maybe... obviously, the name they're plastering all over it is James Gunn. Despite the fact that he's very, very loosely attached to it. It's mostly... I don't know who the director is. The writers are one of James Gunn's brothers. Not Sean, but another one. And one of their cousins, I think, wrote it. So it's like, if it had maybe James Gunn's actual touch to it... If it would be something, it sort of feels like it's looking at the superhero genre through the same scope that James Gunn was, like, the creature genre when he did Slither, is what it kind of feels like. But I don't know. But even Elizabeth Banks wasn't working for me. And Elizabeth Banks always works for me. She was the one thing that worked about that Power Rangers movie. She's award-worthy in the Hunger Games movies. Elizabeth Banks can do so much. And I couldn't even buy her in this. So that's... And then it eventually gets to a climax and an ending and an ultimate payoff that you can see coming from a mile away. It's really very predictable after a certain extent. And so that's a bummer that feels like a lot of wasted potential. But I'm curious how other people are going to feel about it, but I don't know, because if some people are going to go into it looking for those, sort of simple things, like they want to see just a story like this in general, or they want to see, somewhat well-executed gore. The eye scene isn't real. I think that's what also threw me off about the really gory moment, was that the whole eye thing doesn't look as... Like, the eye thing in John Wick looked more real. But yeah, if you're like some sort of gore fan or whatever, just the one scene alone will be worth the price of admission for you. It's certainly a scene I never want to see again, but there it is. So yeah, that's unfortunate, but maybe people will get a kick out of this, but it really wasn't. I just really couldn't. Just it just wasn't grabbing to me at all. Sorry. And we're gonna end on The Hustle. Um, the Anne Hathaway Rebel Wilson remake of Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, which in turn is a remake of the Marlon Brando David Niven movie Bedtime Story. But it's really basically trying to be a carbon copy of Dirty Rotten Scoundrels specifically. Once again, just kind of a chopped down version of it. Like, if you're as familiar with Dirty Rotten Scoundrels as I am, because I love that, it might be one of my favorite comedies. It is brilliant. You can see, this movie just feels like, this movie feels really short, because it's like, it's the exact same movie, they just took so much out of it. But otherwise, it's pretty much the same movie from beginning to end. Just significantly worse. So much worse. More so than you might even be thinking. Might even be imagining. So basically what they've done here is they take the exact same story with the exact same layout, the exact same payoff, the exact same jokes. They just add people falling over and Rebel Wilson rambling incoherently. And voila, you've got a 2019 comedy. So yeah, as you might know, the story is you've got the two con artists who, and obviously in Dirty Rotten Scoundrels it was two guys conning women, rich women that they could, give sob stories to and convince them to give them money and all that, and then get away with it. And they eventually meet each other and realize what the other does, and they get intrigued by the other. Then the younger one kind of wants to go under the wing of the more seasoned one, and then eventually there's a rivalry, and they both make a wager on one particular woman, or in this case guy, that they can extract a certain amount of money out of them, and the first one to do it gets the money, and the other just has to leave. And never, because this is like a whole playground for con people like them. So that's the setup. This movie does the same thing, but there are a lot of scenes where we don't have, Michael Caine adding the charm to it. We don't have Steve Martin's, masterful hold on comedy. We've got Anne Hathaway doing the whole accent thing. Once again, accents are never something I really get too bent out of shape about. But this is like, it almost, I really like Anne Hathaway a lot. But because of the way she speaks in this movie, she is almost entirely unwatchable. And she, every now and then she changes it up also, and it's like, you just want to basically cringe yourself unconscious. Pretty much whenever she speaks, which is the whole movie. And then you've got Rebel Wilson over here she's doing the whole thing where she just rambles, and she's like meandering, nobody bothers to edit this, and worst of all, there's no fucking punchline ever. She just talks. And there were people around me in the theater that were really, really into this. And sure enough, like many terrible movies, like How to Be Single, for instance, that was one of the ones she was in, right? Where she'll just breathe. She just has to breathe, and an audience will just go absolutely insane. She just has to say one word, and an audience will lose their fucking minds. And I don't get it. I do not get the Rebel Wilson thing at all. I know I've been saying that for a long time now. Nothing has changed. If anything, this movie makes it significantly worse. So, yeah, and you can tell. Like, there's individual moments where you can just tell how much they fucked this up. Because because here's the thing, is when I say they even try to do the same jokes, there's one joke I'm surprised they even touched, because it is such an exclusive to Steve Martin joke. It is a joke that feels so much like it's just naturally birthed from him, and this movie tries it with Rebel Wilson. But at the same time, get this, they're kind of not trying it also. Please let me explain. So, the really funny joke, and you have to, I'm not going to do it justice, you have to hear Steve Martin's delivery, But the whole thing where he sits down on the train, this literally is almost like it's its own Steve Martin skit by itself. He sits down in front of the woman on the train, and he's like, oh, I am just starving. I am so hungry. I've been hungry all day. I am so starved right now. And then the waiter comes up and he's like, oh, yes, I've been starving all day. And it's like, oh, look at these prices. These prices. Oh, I'll have a water. That's the joke. It's, after all that. And Rebel Wilson actually tries this, but it's not really told as a joke or a bit. She just says it. She's just like, oh yeah, I've been hungry, and then she like she's trying to do the thing where what he did was he was playing it up for the woman so the woman would buy him the really expensive dinner. But that was the joke that led into it, and eventually he got to the point to where he's like, oh, you don't have to do that. The scene just eventually just starts with her saying, I'll just have water because I can't afford this. And it's like, they didn't even try to make it a joke. And it was, and that in itself, and that's the fact that that's so early, it was like, this is the direction, this is the movie. This is where we're headed. This is the Omen telling us everything we're about to watch right now, isn't it? Where it's like, the movie is here, we're going to keep all the jokes because we don't want to come up with our own shit whatsoever, but we're not going to put any effort in it whatsoever. We are just going to lay it out there. And the whole, entertaining factor is the fact that it's Anne Hathaway and Rebel Wilson. We're not going to add anything to it, except letting Rebel Wilson do all the things that makes her unwatchable. And that's the movie. Once again, another pretty short one. Once again, about an hour 35. And it's merciful that it's that short. Really. Like, it's almost a compliment to this movie that it's that short. But that's the thing, is imagine what I'm saying here, where pretty much all of Rebel Wilson's scenes, and she's in most of the movie, are just her rambling and doing that thing where there's never a punchline. Just her saying words, individual words, is supposed to be the height of hilarity for her. Imagine how much this movie's dragging itself out to even get to an hour and a half. And Dirty Rotten Scoundrels is like an hour 50, and it is just constant. Like, every single turn, the movie has something up its sleeve. And even the moments that don't necessarily work in Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, you better believe the hustle brought that shit too. So there's one big problem I have with Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, and they still find many ways around it. But it's the fact that they kind of put themselves in a corner that they had a hard time getting out of, where it's like, they do the different sort of cons and all that to get all these women, and then you get to the point in Dirty Rotten Scoundrels where he decides he's going to be in the wheelchair, pretend to be in the wheelchair. But the way the movie backs itself into a corner is that now the character now has to stick with that, which is the joke. And it's good that it has to commit to that, and it does, because it's disciplined, but the problem here is that the script kind of got stuck with it too, the same way the character did. So that just has to be what his character is now. And I thought that was kind of an issue in that movie. In this one, they do the exact same thing, only instead, they do change it, and you're like, okay, that was kind of a problem where it felt like they backed themselves into a corner. So if you're going to remake this, that means you're going to maybe try to improve that, or maybe not put yourself in as much of a corner. Okay, lay it on us. What are you going to do instead? Now it's Rebel Wilson pretending to be blind. Congratulations, your corner is now smaller than it ever was. So, and that is just so, because you got the big payoff scene where Michael Caine pretends to be the doctor, and you're like, oh, how's this going to go down? How's he going to fuck with Steve Martin? And so, like, he has to pretend that he doesn't have any feelings in his legs, so Michael Caine just keeps whipping them, and Steve Martin just has to hold in the pain the longer and longer this goes on, doing every single thing that he can to not break his cover. And it's great watching. I love when comedy adds suspense to the comedy, to where you're just on the edge of your seat wondering if he's gonna break or not. And they do this with Rebel Wilson and her blindness, but the whole scene makes no fucking sense whatsoever. The stuff that Anne Hathaway is doing to her has fuck all to do with being blind. So, like, one example is, like, so she gets up, she tries to, like, almost hit her in the face, which works to an extent, because she has to see the thing coming and not flinch. But I would think a blind person would still feel that shit. I can feel a breeze doing this. So even if she flinched, that wouldn't mean anything. And then you've got the whole thing where she starts blowing into her eyes, and she says, if you're blind, you can't feel this. Am I just unaware of how blind people work? Because this makes no sense to me. And then, the big payoff, we gotta go the gross-out route, because it's a 2019 comedy, with no brain in it whatsoever. So she's gotta take, like, some piece of food or whatever, and she goes and she dips it into a toilet, and then feeds it to Rebel Wilson. But the thing is that when she goes and she puts this thing in the toilet, she's way out of Rebel Wilson's eye line. And so, what is this? What is this? This has nothing to do with anything! What is this shit? And there's a whole scene. That's what they did. That's what they did to that scene in Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, where we're waiting to see if Steve Martin reacts to getting his legs whipped. Is this bullshit. This is how they're upgrading it. This is how they're trying to get themselves out of a corner and be smarter and build on their scene and their setup. There's nothing in sight here. There's no, like I said, there's no punchline, there's no payoff to anything, and there's sure as shit no brain present either. And then, after a while, it gets to a point where, once again, you can just see the contrast. Because you've got the whole montage where Michael Caine is teaching Steve Martin how to do all this stuff. And it's great because Michael Caine just really just seems like he'd be one of these guys in this role. And it's so perfect to see him describe, like, his methods. And then we see Steve Martin sort of playing on that. Yeah, they get a little lowbrow, like he pisses behind a tree and all that. But I mean, here, the hustle is just so bored with itself. This amounts to... Anne Hathaway literally just has to blow a horn in this scene. It's a montage of Anne Hathaway explaining her stuff, and the only joke here is that Rebel Wilson's falling asleep. So there's just a prolonged moment of Anne Hathaway blowing a horn. And that's what it is. And obviously, believe it or not, Rebel Wilson finds a way to flop around on the floor at some point during this montage also. So, what are you... I don't really understand where they were coming from. I mean, there's the obvious one where it's like, we're in 2019 and it's sort of like, let's sort of turn this on itself. And it's like, now that, women are having this particular time, it's like, take the plot where it's the two guys, being predatory towards the woman, and it's like, let's do the opposite and see how they like it. Which, by the way, given the twist, makes this whole thing a moot point. But regardless, and that's the thing too, is the final payoff is like, once again, you're remaking a movie that's very familiar to a lot of people. So to make this movie worthwhile, given that there is a turn at the end, if you were going to have to retell this story, and you want to do something differently, maybe give it another payoff, because if you don't change the payoff, we know what it is the entire movie. So there is no point to any of this. And you better believe they don't change a damn thing. They make it worse, but as far as what it is, they don't change it at all. So, basically, the only enjoyment you can possibly get out of this is if you have never seen either one of those original movies, and Rebel Wilson doing fuck all nothing makes you laugh your fucking ass off, and for some reason you get enjoyment out of Anne Hathaway's terrible, terrible accents, you might possibly just be able to get something out of this. And that goes also into the whole thing of I'm talking about updating it. Obviously, you watch the Ruprecht stuff in Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, which, if you're unaware, Michael Caine introduces Steve Martin, who's playing a character for these people that Michael Caine's bringing home, and the punchline is that Ruprecht, this character that Steve Martin is playing, Michael Caine describes in the movie as special. So in 1988, you can imagine what kind of character Ruprecht is. So it's like, okay, you can't do that in 2019, so how are they going to do the Ruprecht scene now? It's Rebel Wilson wearing a wig and just acting weird. Just doing weird shit. That's it. Basically what she's been doing the whole movie. She's wearing a wig now. And eventually the movie does try to find a heart. There's the really sincere moment in Dirty Rotten Scoundrels when Michael Caine finds a heart with Glenn Headley, and he's like, you know what, we shouldn't do this because she's sincere and she's an innocent. And we can't do this. That's, like, against my... Like, I had a set of rules when I do this, and she breaks them, so we're gonna let her go. Because the characters actually had, you know, like, dimensions to them. In this one, that scene involves 30 seconds of the guy talking with piano and violins playing, and voila, Rebel Wilson's a new character like that. So they're kind of switching it up by Rebel Wilson's the one that has the turn, but it's... of all the things that you could have maybe fixed in a movie that's already amazing, you're changing shit that's not... It doesn't fucking matter. This is probably going to be one of the worst movies of the year, easily. Like, I don't know... I mean, there's some shit that's been floating around this year, but this is probably the worst so far. And it's mid-May, so I don't know what else to say about this. What a worthless piece of shit this is. Good God. So, that's going to be this. Next week is... Oh God, Aladdin? Maybe? Aladdin and Booksmart. Yes. And that's when Brightburn will be out there as well. So, yeah, I'll see what... I'm so morbidly curious about Aladdin at this point. I'm almost kind of excited for it just to see what the hell happens. And the more I hear about Booksmart, the more I'm kind of interested in that too. So, yeah, and then if anything else comes up, we'll have that too. I still want to try to do that whole catch-up video thing, which I will do eventually. We're going to hopefully be talking about a couple of franchises very, very soon. One of which I'm currently in the process of preparing. So, all that. And a Versus that I prepared like 2 weeks ago that I haven't done yet. So that too. So all that stuff is coming. So until all that stuff, that's it for this.